The light on the Palawan passage was a flat, pewter sheen, the kind that hides teeth beneath a calm surface. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, peering from the bridge wing of Atago, had already waved off 2 periscope calls that morning as nervous eyes inventing ghosts. The third report earned only a weary frown and a mutter. Phantoms. 23 minutes later, the sea erupted in geysers along Atago's starboard side as 4 torpedoes from USS Data ripped into the flagship. Oil leapt to flame. Steel shrieked. Kurita went into the water as his command rolled and sank in 18 minutes. Nearby, USS Dace would send Maya under and maul Takao. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had not yet properly begun, but one of its prefaces was written in submarine wakes. That violent preface exposes a larger truth. For 3 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy could not make itself believe what American submarines were achieving. Even as tonnage vanished by the million, Japanese staff work, habits, and culture filtered bad news until it looked manageable. The result was not merely miscalculation. It was institutional self-harm. To see why the blindness held, you have to roll the clock back to the 1920s and 1930s and step into the lecture rooms of the Naval War College in Tokyo. The syllabi sang a single song, Decisive Battle. The exquisite symmetry of Tsushima, 1905, haunted every chalkboard. It promised that a disciplined, night-fighting, torpedo-perfect fleet could annihilate a larger enemy in the Western Pacific, if only the battles would be shaped correctly. In this vision, submarines were adjuncts, long-range scouts and attrition nibblers on the way to the grand surface duel. To spend precious torpedoes on merchants was, by this light, ungentlemanly and strategically trivial. You killed fleets, then you owned oceans. Commerce would fall as a byproduct of victory, not its means. Doctrines how burden into procurement. Japan built an array of technically impressive boats, long-legged I-class giants capable of scouting vast arcs, even carrying float planes. Their training emphasized warship targets, meticulous firing solutions, and patience for the perfect shot against a cruiser or carrier. What they largely did not practice was the dirty, persistent work of strangling trade. Convoy stalking, night surface attacks in packs, radar-driven interception, and the 1,000 small tactics that made the Atlantic a classroom in pain. Bias reinforced itself early. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese submarines ranged widely and produced modest merchant results by their own measure, dozens of ships, not hundreds, tonnage in the low hundreds of thousands, not the millions. Staff officers nodded, satisfied. See, commerce war is inefficient, and if our boats, with superior crews and long-range torpedoes, don't dent Allied trade much, the Americans, whom we rate as technically and spiritually inferior underwater, surely won't do better. Then the Americans started doing better. From the first weeks of 1942, US boats began plucking at Japanese logistics, lone tramps, oilers, and troop transports. But inside Tokyo's plotting rooms, loss classification was a controlled substance. If a ship disappeared without survivors, the default category was marine casualty or unknown. If a survivor remembered a noise but not a wake, it became probable mine. Only if someone saw the torpedo track or the conning tower did the loss count as a submarine kill. Add to this the Army-Navy wall. The IJA controlled its own sizable fleet of transports and hoarded grim news, and the picture on the Navy's desk always lagged reality by a gulf wide enough to sail a convoy through. Why the need to misclassify? Doctrine and face. To admit submarines were gutting your lifeline was to confess theirs. At a whole intellectual edifice, decisive battleism, contempt for cowardly commerce war, faith in spiritual force over industrial arithmetic, had cracks running from foundation to roof. Better, then, to call an exploding tanker the work of a minefield or a storm than to rewrite the curriculum in the middle of a war. Meanwhile, on the American side of the ocean, a different learning curve bent upward. 1942 had been hobbled by the scandal of faulty US torpedoes, duds, deep runners, circular runs. But by early 1943, hard-fought fixes and field ingenuity brought the Mark 14 and its magnetic contact fuses to workable reliability, and radar sets matured into trustworthy SJIs that could see at night beyond the horizon. Add in code breaking, the growing ability to read Japanese routing and convoy schedules, and the mathematics changed. January 1943 alone saw US subs destroy scores of vessels. By mid-year, monthly kills routinely pierced the 250,000-ton mark. The Pacific, once an empire's highway, acquired tolls paid in steel and fire. Japanese escort doctrine lagged. Convoying was ad hoc, escorts scant, communications brittle. The new Grand Escort Command, late 1943, had a mission but few tools. Sonar a generation behind, little to no radar. Depth charges often set too shallow because staff tables assumed submarines lived near 100 to 150 feet, while American boats were comfortable deep and, fatally, on the surface at night. It is hard to kill what you refuse to see in the way it actually fights. Culture-colored tactics. Reports from escort commanders who wrote bluntly about submarines carving through convoys came back edited to gentler tones. A diary might say, departed with 12, arrived with 4, no weather present, repeated submarine attacks. The monthly summary would read, sporadic losses to various causes, convoy operations satisfactory. If you are a lieutenant getting depth charge drums by the dozen, and a captain in Tokyo tells you the losses are sporadic, you begin to feel as if you've slipped dimensions. Even within the submarine arm, Japanese doctrine misaimed its sharp tools. The long-range, fast, deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedo made night surface actions a terror for Allied cruisers and destroyers. But torpedoes the submariners loaded were saved for ships with guns, not ships with holds. The very prestige of their weapon pushed them toward targets that fit the heroic frame and away from the work that would have crippled an island empire, murdering tankers and tramps until factories starved. By late 1943, starvation had begun, statistically at first, then physically. Japan entered the war with roughly 6.3 million tons of merchant shipping, and added, through captures and frantic builds, another few million. Yet the net fleet kept shrinking. Cargoes that fed steel mills in Honshu didn't arrive. Bauxite that became aircraft skin stayed in the Indies. Tankers that should have pumped lifeblood into refineries clawed the water and then didn't anymore because there is no swimming for a ship. Leadership meetings, liaison conferences between the Army and Navy, should have been emergency rooms for this hemorrhage. Instead, transcripts reveal verbal sandbags, temporary disruptions, port congestion, weather. Weather became a euphemism for torpedoes. Congestion became a euphemism for routes rearranged to avoid wolves with periscopes. And temporary dragged on into 1944 as the Americans formed wolfpacks of their own. Small groups of boats cued by code breaking and radar to concentrate against fat, slow convoys. The pack demonstrations were savage lessons ignored. In August 1944, convoy High 71 crept north from Singapore with oil, rubber, tin, and thousands of troops. Rasher, spadefish, redfish, bluefish hunted it like a practiced team at night. Torpedoes walked down columns of freighters. Fires chased men into black seas slick with burning fuel. Over 8,500 lives ended in a night that official paperwork later called partial success. It is a peculiar language where 7 ships and tens of thousands of tons become partial. The most critical artery was always oil. Japan's war plan depended on the Dutch East Indies bounty, making the long journey home in tankers. Submarines made those tankers their first prey. The numbers tell a story colder than memory. Tanker capacity that briefly peaked in 1943 fell in half by early 1945. 1 month in late 1944 saw 20-plus tankers smashed in barely 4 weeks. And still, shoreside planners issued sailing orders that described speed as defense, as if knots alone defeated radar, and a night surface attack by a boat with a low silhouette and a captain who knew the rhythm of your convoy signals. You can measure blindness with tonnage charts and attrition curves. You can also measure it with single moments, the kind you can hold like the edge of a shard. A radio operator surviving his 5th torpedoing told an officer this was no streak of bad luck. He was told he exaggerated. A merchant captain who begged for escorts and zigzags was told to hold course and faith. A tanker skipper who logged multiple submarine contacts saw his loss filed as probable mine. In the end, the line from doctrine to denial is straight. If you teach a generation of officers that honor lives in decisive battle, that the enemy's commerce war is both indecent and ineffective, then when the enemy strangles you with that very war, accepting the fact feels like bouncing a check on your soul. Better to shade the numbers and hope the next convoy slips through. Better to read periscopes as waves, until the wave hurls 4 steel cylinders at your flagship and writes a new doctrine in fire. The tragedy is not that Japan failed to foresee American submarine power. Few saw the precise scale coming. The tragedy is that evidence, month after month of sinkings, diaries from escorts, merchant protests, tonnage spreadsheets with negative slopes, arrived in time to provoke changes that might have saved enough ships to slow the spiral. Instead, the system treated truth as contraband. The price of that contraband, unpaid in the moment, came due in 1944 and 1945, with interest measured in millions of tons. What American submarines were doing was not magic. It was a system: reliable torpedoes, radar that made night your ally, radio intelligence that made oceans smaller, wolfpack tactics that multiplied force, skippers trained to take initiative, logistics that brought fuel, spare parts, and plasma to forward bases, and a bureaucracy willing, often painfully, to admit errors and fix them. Against that kind of system, valor and seamanship on individual Japanese ships could not compensate for a staff culture that called a torpedo a storm. When Kurita kicked free of Atago's suction and found himself among oil and splinters, he was not merely a man in the water. He was a metaphor afloat in his own institution's denial. The submarine war had been writing in wakes for 2 years. Now it scrawled its name across a flagship's death throes. Whether the bridge believed in phantoms had ceased to matter. The mathematics did not care. In the next part, we'll step closer to the arithmetic. 1943 to 44 as the hinge, wolfpacks, radar, and code-breaking as levers, the cutting of the tanker throat, and why, even as the numbers broke loud enough to hear over surf, headquarters kept humming the old song. If 1942 was apprenticeship and 1943 the first confident semester, then 1944 was the year American submarines graduated and immediately took a professorship in destruction. The syllabus was brutal and exact: hunt the tankers, break the convoys, use night as a cloak and radar as an extra sense, share the ocean by radio so that no target sailed alone in the dark for long. It was not romance, it was logistics waged as war. Start with the quiet revolution in electronics. The SJ surface search radar now sat, humming and reliable, on the shears of every fleet boat. What had been fussy in 1942 and temperamental in early 1943 matured into an instrument you trusted like your own eye, except it saw farther and did not blink at night. Radar let submarines run on the surface faster than a submerged boat could ever dream, overhauling convoys from beyond visual range, weaving into attack positions with periscope exposure kept to seconds. It also turned the American night attack into a repeatable procedure rather than an art that depended on a captain's nerves alone. Then add radio intelligence. The tireless work of communicators and cryptanalysts collapsed the Pacific's distances. Convoy signals, routing changes, even the bureaucratic rhythm of Japanese shipping orders began to leak meaning. A commander reading his nightly dispatch might learn that a high-series convoy had cleared Singapore with oil and tin. A wolfpack could fan out along likely tracks guided by math and experience rather than wishful thinking. The ocean, formerly the ally of the hunted, became the hunter's ally too. Now pack it. The US borrowed and adapted the wolfpack concept, scaling it to Pacific realities. 3 or 4 boats, often under a pack commander in the senior boat, would coordinate stalking and attack, handing targets off on voice radio at night, pinning convoys between converging lines of torpedoes. If a damaged freighter staggered out of line, someone in the pack saw the smoke and finished the work. If escorts peeled off to chase one contact, the others pressed in. Japanese escorts, starved of radar and training, found themselves outnumbered at the decisive instant, even when their head count said otherwise. Consider High 71 again. It sailed with 6 escorts, weighty by Japanese standards, guarding a dozen ships loaded with oil, rubber and men. The pack harassed it, fixed it, and then ripped it. In the kill lists, you see names that recede from memory unless you served aboard them. Troop ships swallowing thousands in minutes. Cargoes of strategic materials turned into black smoke. Officers in escort bridges forced to choose between trying to chase radar pips they could not see and staying glued to a formation that was dissolving anyway. Afterward, paperwork tried to round the edges. The sea kept the sharper record. The Americans had learned a hard lesson in the Atlantic and applied it. Tankers first. In an industrial war, oil is not a commodity, it is a currency. Japan's own planning admitted this in peacetime. Indeed, the very logic of early conquests turned on seizing the Dutch East Indies oil fields. But seizing is not moving. Oil that sits in Sumatra might as well sit on the moon if it cannot slide into a refinery at home. When US boats made a priority of sinking oil carriers, they were not chasing numbers. They were choking flight hours, paralyzing fleets, and shrinking training pipelines. Numbers can be anesthetic in their abstraction. Make them specific. In a single month of late 1944, more than 20 tankers went down. Each represented not just hull steel, but a chain. Crude oil that would have become aviation gasoline. Gasoline that would have spun up radial engines. Engines that would have lifted fighters to meet B-29s or provided 100 hours of pilot training instead of 40. Cut enough of those links and you get not merely fewer planes in the air, but worse pilots in the planes. Vice Admiral Onishi, architect of the kamikaze, did not need a spreadsheet to understand the choice he articulated: one-way fuel or no mission at all. Meanwhile, Japanese anti-submarine warfare improved at the edges but not at the core. You can drill courage and reward sharp seamanship. You cannot conjure radar out of thin logistics when bauxite never arrives. Vacuum tubes are scarce, and specialized manufacturing is bombed or starved. Depth charges multiplied but often exploded above where American boats lurked. Sonar hums were vague. Training cycles were short because escorts were needed yesterday. The result was a theater where individual acts of escort bravery, dashes down wakes, patterns dropped with hope, struggled against a skilled, networked enemy. Tactically, US boats refined their repertoire. The classic end around at night, surfaced, fast, silent to radar, a patch of black within black, set up bow-on spreads that hurt convoys more than single shots ever could. Daylight brought submerged stalking, periscopes shone like needles between whitecaps for seconds at a time. Skippers perfected salvo timing to walk torpedoes along columns. A hit near the bow to freeze a ship dead in the water. A second to break its back. A third into the oil. If an escort bore down, a sharp dive and a quiet slide below thermal layers put steel and water between hunter and hunted. Patrol reports read with a professional detachment that makes the carnage feel procedural. Fired 4 at tanker, observed 2 hits. Secondary explosions, commenced attack on second column. By 1944, the exchange ratio had become obscene. Japan might sink or damage a handful of American submarines in a year, precious losses for the US mourned on piers across Pearl and Fremantle, but commerce destruction rolled on with minimal interruption. For every American boat lost, hundreds of thousands of tons of Japanese shipping vanished. Put cruelly, if you are a staff officer looking at the graph, you would conclude that even catastrophic luck for the Americans would not arrest the trend. The US could afford it. Japan could not. Denial mutated rather than died. Headquarters statements began acknowledging increased submarine activity while still minimizing attribution. Mines took the blame for torpedo signatures. Weather remained a euphemism for radar-directed night attacks. Unknown causes covered what convoy survivors could plainly describe. The etiquette of staff papers was maintained as if manners could slow a sinking. Into this theatre walked stories like USS Batfish in early 1945. 3 Japanese submarines, RO-55, RO-112, RO-113, sunk in 76 hours, each detected first by radar in waters where Japanese sets were rare and weak. It is hard to argue doctrine when your own submarines are being killed by the very technology your staff underfunded. Not all American submarine work was clean. The Awamaru incident, in which USS Queenfish mistakenly torpedoed a ship under safe conduct carrying Red Cross relief, stands as a dark blot, misidentification, fog, pressure, and a decision that cost nearly 2,000 lives. The commander faced courts-martial and censure. The episode mattered morally and legally. It did not alter the macro trajectory. One terrible night does not redeem the chain of months in which convoys died by the week. Behind the sea fights, factories and ministries felt the vice closing. Iron ore from China and Malaya dwindled in the numbers that matter to blast furnaces. Bauxite shipments fell off cliffs. Aluminum output followed. Aircraft plants became museums of idle jigs. Coal struggled to move. Power plants coughed and dimmed. Medicines grew rare. Rice piled up in regions and starved elsewhere. The submarine's true target, circulation, bled out. Bombers smash facilities. Submarines amputate arteries. The psychology of the sea lanes warped accordingly. Merchant crews, derided in peacetime and exploited in war, lived casualty rates higher than many frontline units. Sailings felt like coin tosses with a weighted coin. After 2 or 3 sinkings, some men refused to go again and were branded cowards because no bureaucratic category existed for cumulative terror in civilians. That invisibility, too, is a kind of denial. The state's refusal to recognize that its blood is carried by men who don't wear the right color braid. By early 1945, the visible theater shrank. Convoys bunched in harbors. Operation Starvation, B-29, aerial mining, closed home waters with a padlock. The Navy lacked the tools and fuel to pick. It's important to understand why mining worked so quickly. Submarines had already smashed the mine warfare fleet's fuel and equipment pipelines. Japan knew, technically, what kind of mines fell and how to sweep them. Knowing without mobilization capacity is academic. The last long convoy route from Singapore died in late March 1945 under combined submarine and bomber attacks that destroyed tankers like Soamaru. No subsequent attempt would run that gauntlet. The war that began with oil as casus belli ended with empty tanks, not because wells ran dry, but because steel could not move. Through all of this, there were voices that grasped what was happening. Escort captains who wrote bluntly, submarine officers who warned as early as 1942 that American doctrine aimed at commerce, analysts who projected millions of tons lost if countermeasures were not intensified. Those voices were sidelined as defeatist or misaligned with the service's self-image. Institutions defend self-images the way ships defend watertight integrity, aggressively, until the water comes in too fast. In a grim calculus, American submarine success derives as much from Japanese non-adaptation as from American adaptation. The US fixed torpedoes, standardized radar, executed packs, integrated code-breaking, and refined doctrine in the crucible. Japan, even after late recognition, never fielded adequate convoy protection. Too few escorts, too little radar, too little training, too late. Pride in the pre-war submarine arm, its range and daring, its giant boats, translated into misplaced target sets rather than reoriented strategy. By the time an admiral in a conference room said, "We must convoy everything and escort heavily," the sinkings had already chewed through the industrial base that could have produced those escorts and trained those crews. Submarines are time machines in one sense. They push a strategic reckoning forward by months and years. In 1944, Japan was living 1945 consequences. And in staff minutes you can feel 1942's confidence refusing to vacate the chair it no longer owned. So when you read the final tallies, thousands of ships served. 55.3 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping destroyed by the submarine force. You should not imagine only the moments of impact and flame. Imagine factories that idled for lack of ore, pilots who never logged their 200th hour, escorts whose sonar rooms were quiet because the sets never arrived, families inland who ate thinner rice because coastal tramps lay on their sides in deep water. Submarines write in wakes. The sentences are read in ration books and production sheets. The wonder, often voiced by U.S. skippers in their patrol reports, was not, "we did so well," but "they did not change." That astonishment carried no malice. It was the professional's disbelief that an adversary would stick with a plan after its premises had been disproved at sea, in blood, 100 times. In the final part, we'll reckon with the ledger entire, the official numbers versus the truth, the slow post-war admissions, the human costs that do not fit into tonnage, and the lesson modern militaries study from Japan's refusal to believe that denial is not a shield, it is a hole in your hull. Part 3. The ledger at war's end. Tonnage, truth, and the price of denial. 1,500 words. At the end, there are always numbers. They do not capture everything, but they anchor the story where memory wants to drift. By August 1945, the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee would credit the American submarine force with sinking roughly 1,314 Japanese vessels, about 1,113 merchantmen, and over 200 naval ships, for a total of 5.32 million tons of merchant shipping alone, a tad more than 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. The US lost 52 submarines in the Pacific, gallows arithmetic that yields exchange ratios by tonnage and by unit count, so lopsided they read like typos until you stare long enough to accept them. Japan's final wartime staff paper, drafted days before surrender, still undercounted submarine-attributed losses by half. That stubborn undercount is a perfect mirror of what went wrong. The institution would rather fight the spreadsheet than the submarines. But a ledger is more than tonnage. It tallies things we pretend are intangible: fuel hours, training cycles, breathing space for industry. Japanese steel production, which reached millions of tons in 1943, collapsed toward a rounding error by 1945, not because furnaces exploded, but because iron ore and coal did not arrive in the combinations and quantities blast furnaces require. Aluminum output fell off a cliff as bauxite imports withered. Factories possessing machines, workers, and blueprints lacked feedstock. That is submarine war's particular cruelty. It shatters circulation, leaving organs intact and dying. And though the submarine force did not directly invent kamikaze, it helped create the conditions, the fuel famine, that incentivized one-way flights. If you can train a pilot for 40 hours and fuel one mission, or train him for 300 hours and then not fuel 10 missions, a desperate staff will choose the squalid arithmetic of one shot. That is not a defense of the choice, it is an indictment of the scarcity behind it. On the human side, the ledger shows a class of casualties that do not march in parades: merchant mariners. Roughly 27,000 Japanese civilians working the sea lanes died, sunk at rates that equaled or exceeded frontline units. Their obituaries were thin. The culture lauded the special attack pilot. It sighed and moved on from the radio operator who survived 5 sinkings, only to be told by an officer that he was unlucky rather than a witness to systemic failure. Post-war memoirs from merchant crews are full of anger without address. They begged for escorts. They were told to sail independently. When they were torpedoed, reports blamed their seamanship. Even among naval professionals, post-war interviews reveal an oscillation between candor and self-protection. Some admirals admitted that doctrine had ossified. They had bet the WWII realm on a decisive battle that never came, and in clinging to that frame, they left the nation's arteries unguarded. Others preferred the narrative that temporary disruptions and enemy airpower explained shortages, as if the submarine record were an impolite guest best kept in the foyer. A few, escorts, convoy commanders, spoke with the plain grief of men who watched tramps and tankers roll, their depth charges still strapped on because there was no time to jettison. The Americans, for their part, interrogated the victory with a mix of pride and bewilderment. Skippers like Eugene Fluckey, USS Barb, and Dick O'Kane, USS Tang, names stamped into the law, wrote of professional satisfactions and losses, of near misses under hedgehog patterns that rolled overhead like second chances, of torpedoes that ran true because ordnance officers and frontline captains had fought their own bureaucracy in 1942-43 to fix them. Mixed into the pride is that recurring line, "We expected the enemy to adapt. They did not, or did so thinly and late." One must not tidy the narrative into American infallibility. The U.S. submarine arm began the war with scandalous torpedo defects, errant staff guidance, and skippers who needed hard patrols to grow into killers. The crucial difference is that the errors were admitted and corrected fast enough to matter. That is not a cultural taunt, it is a strategic principle. In war, institutions live or die by how quickly they convert evidence into change. If you want a single image to set beside Kurita in the oil near Palawan, take Emperor Hirohito after the surrender, studying charts of surviving merchant tonnage, under 1.5 million tons left from a 1942 control of something north of 10 million when conquests are counted. When he asked, "How did we lose so much shipping?" the answer finally came plain: submarines, and our own refusal to accept what they were doing. There is a temptation, especially for enthusiasts of surface action and aviation drama, to file submarine war under supporting actor. The drama. A lax scale. No sweeping formations of carriers, no great gun duels, mostly small crews in steel cigars doing math in the dark. And yet the math reconfigures everything. A battleship without fuel is a park ornament. A fighter without training hours is a bullet with wings. A factory without ore is a museum. Submarines, fewer than 2% of US Navy manpower, forced those downgrades across an empire. The Japanese submarine force, ironically, was a marvel of engineering ambition. Long-range giants, even the fantastical I-400s with aircraft aboard. But specification is not strategy. A navy can be simultaneously brave and misaimed. To train men to hunt cruisers while tankers pass in convoy is to wield a spear at the wrong target set. To equip escorts without radar is to send them as blind shepherds into a night full of wolves with eyes. To call an exploding tanker weather is to replace strategy with ritual. There were off-ramps. The Germans, hard learners in the Atlantic, offered technology and tactics, effective sonar, radar detectors, pack doctrine, acoustic torpedoes for anti-submarine work. Japanese attaches wrote home about these. Procurement balked, production sputtered, and pride filed the memo where inconvenient truths go to nap. Pride is a poor ASW system. Where does this leave the lesson for modern militaries and states? It is not build more submarines, it is fix your bias fast. When an adversary exploits the economic nervous system, fiber optics today, shipping lanes then, energy grids always, the proper institutional reaction is not to quarrel with the premise because it insults tradition. It is to reallocate attention and resources now, even if the reallocation humiliates cherished doctrine. The humiliation is cheaper than defeat. The American submarine campaign did not win the war alone. It synced with carrier warfare, Army airpower, island campaigns, Soviet entry and a dozen other pivots. But it pulled a critical linchpin, and it did so in the face of an opponent trained by its own catechism to ignore the pull. When historians call the US submarine force the most cost-effective striking arm in naval history, they are not only praising the force, they are indicting the target's denial. Return at last to the surface, to a quiet stretch of sea a day after a convoy death, when oil still freckles the swells and a few crates bob like ugly flowers. A merchant sailor, hauled into a lifeboat after clinging to a hatch cover all night, stares at the horizon and decides whether he will sail again if he's rescued. Somewhere inland, an engineer opens a ledger and writes, "No ore arrived this week." Somewhere else, a pilot idles in a revetment and shuts down because his training slot has been cancelled. These are one story, a chain reaction triggered by a submarine crew that will never meet any of them. The Japanese could not believe that chain. They had the reports, they had the survivors, they had the empty tanks and the silent mills. But belief is not evidence. It is a choice about how to treat evidence. They chose too often the one that kept the mirror cloudy. And history is not kind to navies that polish doctrine instead of periscopes. So write the epitaph as a lesson, not a taunt. In modern war, production and connection are targets. Denial is ammunition for the enemy. American submarines sank over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping. The tonnage lies on the Pacific floor. The warning floats above it, still visible from any bridge where someone is tempted to call periscopes waves.